Good morning, everybody. I'm very impressed that you're here at 8:30 in the morning. I was very excited when I got this time slot, as you can imagine, but really excited to spend time with you today as a part of a topic that I'm really passionate about, and that's FinOps. The first time I did this presentation was last reInvent, and I didn't know how it would go. It ultimately went well, and they asked me to do it again, which is great, but I didn't want to do the same presentation year over year. So this past April, I was a part of a great event in Madrid where I got introduced to a leader I was really inspired by. So I'm excited later on you're going to hear from Ron, who's the FinOps leader within Wiz Cybersecurity. So it's going to be a blend of what I've done in the past, sharing insights around how to get started with FinOps, how do you expand the impact of that and scale. But also you're going to go deep into a customer use case story as Ron comes up as a part of that. For those of you that I don't know, my name is Chris Hennessy. I'm an enterprise finance strategist at AWS. I'm approaching my 4-year anniversary sometime early next year, and I've met with over 1,000 customers in that time. Prior to joining AWS, I was the technology CFO at Capital One. So I spent over 20 years at Capital One driving through managing data centers, building data centers, deprecating data centers, and then migrating to the cloud. And I have a lot of lessons learned, not only from that experience, but from the hundreds of customers that I've engaged with. So I'm excited to share some of those stories with you today as a part of this session and dive deeper into this. As many of you know, and I don't know your specific companies, but most organizations I meet with are either on-prem or hybrid in nature. They're engaging with a single cloud provider, still have an on-premise footprint, and are thinking through how to drive through that change. And as you manage an on-prem data center, there's a couple of considerations that exist as you manage that. The top 3 things that came to mind for me was there's a big element of capital expenditure and CapEx and planning that exists there. Anybody who's managed elements of the software elements and asset and management knows it's a big challenge to keep up with what's all the infrastructure, what is it tied to, how do I best align to that? And really getting insight in terms of the complexity of the vendors you engage with through this. The beauty of the cloud is it simplifies a lot of this as you go through it. The scalability and elasticity of cloud enables your business to flex as needed as long as you architect for that. You also get a lot of transparency. I'm going to share a lot of best practices today around how do you get insight. I get calls from a lot of CFOs who don't know a lot about cloud, and usually the question they ask is, what am I paying for and what is even in this bill? So they want insight in terms of awareness inside of their business, who's consuming it, what's the accountability model look like within that, and how can we actually drive change to get the cost savings that's expected as you go through the cloud. And lastly is just simplification. The way in which you can leverage pay-as-you-go model, get access to a lot of software in terms of AWS Marketplace. It makes things a lot easier in terms of managing that ecosystem. But in all of my conversations, although you may leverage the cloud, there's some things that change as you move to the cloud, and there's others that stay the same. So I thought I'd talk through them. The first is the beauty of, as you move to the cloud, is a bit of a forcing function for IT and finance to work together. A lot of times I'll work with CIOs or CTOs, and I'll ask, what's your relationship like with your finance team? You can imagine the scale of answers I get as a part of that, to I don't know my finance team, I don't hear from them, to they're deeply embedded in the business, and there's a wide spectrum through that. The beauty of leveraging the cloud, and specifically as we go deeper into FinOps, it's a perfect opportunity for joint partnership as you manage through this. Next is you need to learn a lot. I know when I first started engaging with AWS, there was a lot of services which I didn't understand. I needed to be able to link that back to what is it actually doing for the business itself and how do I better understand that? So there's a bit of a learning curve you need to understand, but it's something you can pick up very quickly. And lastly is the governance pivot. I hear from customers a lot when they have an on-prem mindset, they're thinking about the buy, and then it's set it and forget it as you think about the infrastructure. That is not a good strategy to leverage with the cloud, as many of you may know. The variable nature can catch up with you as you go through this, and you need to make sure that you're shifting that governance pattern and taking advantage of the scalability, not just set it and forget it and look once a month at your bill. The things that stay the same is the single pane of glass. No matter if you're hybrid, multi-cloud, business leaders and your technical leaders are expecting that single pane of glass. There's not very much sensitivity towards it's hard to consolidate multiple clouds together, on-premise together. There's an expectation that as a leader within a FinOps team, a finance team, or an IT team who's supporting this, that you're able to do this in a seamless way. So I'll share some platforms that I've seen work well later in the presentation around that. The next is forecasting. Forecasting, I get that question a lot, is how do I forecast cloud? How can I do this in an accurate way? What are the ways to do that? So I'll share some insight there. And lastly is allocations. As a prior CFO, I actually love allocations. Most people do not love allocations, but the spirit of actually supporting product level P&L decisions, gaining insight to what the right investment decisions are, but sometimes this can get very complicated. So I'll share some best practices around allocations as well. As you think about FinOps, there's a lot of ways to define this, and you may have your own. This was my own kind of viewpoint, and there's 3 key elements to it. The first is this is a bit of principle and practice. It is a cultural element as a part of it. The second, as you read through this, you'll see the 3 legs of the stool, IT, finance, and the business or product. It's really important to have a joint partnership as you go through this. And lastly, it's not all about cost. It's all about value. And I think that's hard for a lot of teams, especially in finance, to think beyond department IDs, cost centers, IT is a cost center. It's what are those technical teams doing? What's the value they're generating? And does it make sense to drive optimization or to build that new feature? And you really need to think through that as you go through your FinOps journey. A bunch of benefits can come by leveraging a FinOps element as you go through this. The first is accountability. A lot of organizations are seeking the desire for, if an engineer spins up an instance, do they know what well-managed looks like in spinning that down? What's the size of that instance? What does accountability look like as a part of that? And usually for especially large enterprise, it's a very big gap between executives who may manage budgets and engineers who are the ones hands on keyboard doing that. So you need to really find the gap and close that gap as a part of it. Next is decision making. All of this is on behalf of influencing decisions. The spirit of this is to inform and leverage this in a way to make things better inside of your company. Cost control is a big deal. I've been working a long time, so I've seen the cycles of when cost efficiency matters more or revenue growth matters more. But I think having a discipline and a governance structure that we'll talk through today will really help set you up for success. Adaptability is a big one as well. You need to adjust your changing needs, and having a really good FinOps practice enables you to do that. And then lastly is around collaboration. You'll hear this a lot from me, just because I talk to a lot of customers where I feel like a little bit of a counselor as I'm engaging with these customers because I'm connecting dots and teams. You probably should work together here. There's an opportunity. So really thinking about this as an opportunity to build bridges across organizations and to work in joint partnership together. So in terms of framing for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to kind of go, almost think of it like a crawl, walk, run model. It's a slightly different framing. The first is around start. How do you get started? You can imagine the conversations that I have with customers. Most don't have any resources tied to FinOps. They're wondering, what should I even do to begin? So I'm going to talk through some of the specifics of that. Next is how do we grow? Now that you build your practice, which may be one person or a half an FTE or 2 people, how do you grow the impact and the impact that you have inside of the organization? And then lastly, scale. I think one of the biggest gaps I see with customers is leveraging automation as a part of this versus manual effort. So we'll talk through what are the ways in which you can automate these areas. I wouldn't be a good finance person with not having some data, so I found these pretty interesting. You'll hear as you engage with AWS and probably with other cloud providers that you can get cost savings out of leveraging this, which is great. You'll see through this Accenture report, 30% reduction in TCO by migrating to the cloud. That sounds great, and obviously as a practitioner, that's a desired outcome, but as you balance other metrics as you go through this, companies struggle with getting transparency around unit economics. One topic I talk a lot about, and there's some people love, hate, is TCO or total cost of ownership. How do I get insight into what my applications are costing me? What's that enabling for the business, and how do I make that linkage? But a lot of companies can't make that lineage and linkage as a part of it. And then lastly, from this report from Flexera, 30% of cloud spend is waste. One of the things I love to do is review companies' bills. I talk a lot now, so I'm excited to get into the numbers. And as I go into the specifics, there's a lot of organizations that are missing opportunities around how to best buy your cloud services. What are the ways you need to build efficiency into that? I'll talk about KPIs and metrics later, but one of the KPIs I like a lot is resource utilization. How effectively are you leveraging your technical resources? There's an eye to that when you're on-prem, but sometimes when you go to the cloud, you don't continue to maintain an eye on that. So as you think about all of this, it's really important that there's a big opportunity to FinOps big value into your organization as you go through it. As you think about the structure of teams that manage things and the cross-functional nature of this, you basically can see the alignment between insights, alignment, and data across both business, IT, and finance. Most organizations I step into, there's typically maybe a technical or an engineer who's passionate about cost efficiency. Maybe they came from a startup or an ecosystem where it was vital to have this, and then they step into an enterprise and they're wondering how to best do this. Or it's someone in finance who has a technical leaning and an interest. They want to do this in an effective way, and they have curiosity to dive deeper into this. So as you think about this, it tends to be loosely coupled teams inside of it, resources across multiple verticals with a strong interest and passion to make this happen. So as I go through this, you'll see I'll have little tidbits I call cracking the code, and I'll summarize these at the end as well. The first one here is most teams that I engage with are virtual in nature. They don't have dedicated FinOps teams. They're not large in scale. And even if they do have a FinOps team, these are small teams generally. You all have to get scale and automation as a part of this. So be comfortable as you go through this, even if in your organization you don't have a FinOps organization. You could create a loosely coupled team, and I'll talk through what are the objectives of that in a second. Next is when you have a FinOps team, and if any of you are on a FinOps team, this is not easy work because you have to get the attention focus of development teams who sometimes don't want to focus on cost efficiency. Not that they don't care about it, but they are under a lot of pressure to develop new features and capabilities. So one thing that's really vital as you go through your FinOps journey is to make sure there's a clear mission and objective for your FinOps team. I'll talk a little bit about sponsorship later, because I think that's really important. But I know when I had a FinOps team, it can get very frustrating within some of these teams. You see so many opportunities, but nobody's taking action. It's this balancing act. But as long as you have clarity and some objectives, and I drafted some of the ones that I would recommend. First is, what are the best practices across the organization? Next is, how do we gain visibility and insight as a part of a mission for a FinOps team? Savings is a big deal. Obviously, AWS has some great services that enable you to identify where those opportunities are. I know there's a lot of third-party partners that also will identify opportunities. In the end, though, for FinOps as an objective, you need to be able to understand what those opportunities are and who to talk to about going after them. Data is a big deal, as you know, going through your cloud journey, and specifically within FinOps. So you need to have lineage and linkage into how your organization's structured and the way in which you manage cost. So that's a big objective as a part of this team. Alerting, monitoring, especially as you think about automation as you get into this, is a key objective. And specifically a communication strategy. I'll talk a little bit later around incentives and recognition. Sometimes that gets under-focused on as a part of a FinOps journey because people are just grinding on what they need to do. But if you incentivize the right behavior, recognize that, there's a huge compounding effect that usually happens within the engineering community. So the cracking the code here is just make sure you write these in pencil. Think of these almost as tenets inside of an organization and something that you revisit regularly just to ensure your team has a mission and a purpose as you go through your FinOps journey. I get asked a lot, which is what are all the ways in which you can gain insight? So I kind of created the top 5. The first one is around cloud cost managing tools. So obviously AWS, I listed a bunch here, has those tools. I'll talk through in a little bit later what are some third-party tools that I've seen customers have really good success with. But tools obviously won't solve all of your problems. You have to be able to take action on what's within those tools. But thinking about your monitoring, I know anytime I'll meet with a customer and I ask them, what's the practice you use to review your cloud bill? And when they tell me they look at it at month end, I kind of cringe inside a little bit. I was like, this is not a month end kind of process. This is a daily ongoing process you need to keep an eye on because the variable nature of things can get out of whack if uncontrolled. The next is around account and tagging strategy. This is vital inside of an organization. I know most engineers don't value the time spent on tagging, so you have to be very sensitive of your tagging strategy. What's a required tag? What's an optional tag for analytic purposes? You don't want to overburden engineers with a lot of tags. They'll get irritated quickly. I've gotten plenty of feedback on that. But finding the right balance that exists so that you have the transparency. I typically, especially if it's a publicly traded company, I'll look at their 10Q or 10K beforehand. How do they organize their products and businesses? That's the way you should organize your cloud infrastructure. How does it align? Obviously, there's a large shared service element as you get into this, maybe in the data team, the networking team, and such. That's where there's some complexity, and we'll talk through a little bit of that. But if you don't have transparency of your cloud bill and who's consuming it and in what way to then kind of give transparency internally, it's going to be really hard to make a big progress on the FinOps side. Talked about already this. I think some of the best practices I've seen, I work with a lot of government agencies across the globe, and I was really impressed with one government agency where they were pretty disciplined around getting buy-in from application teams around what their forecasts would be in the future year. But they treat it as an upper limit, and they basically set a ceiling of a do not exceed for their app teams. And if it does, it kicks off an escalation clause in terms of what needs to be done when that's the case. So all app teams are focusing on forecasting discipline, cost management, ensuring that if it does hit the upper threshold, there's good reason, business justification for it, but most try to stay away from that upper limit. So use limits and alerts as a way to manage through this. Allocations, as I mentioned, I think chargeback, showback is a big deal. I've got a lot of passion about this topic if somebody afterwards wants to talk about it with your company, but it's a balancing act here of complexity and explainability. It can get very messy as you get deep into this, so my guidance generally is to try to keep it as simple and explainable as possible, and I'll share some insight on that later. And then lastly is just having good rhythm. A lot of times I know when you think about, and somebody who managed IT spend for a long time, you're in a discipline of sharing insight, but are you sharing that insight on the cloud side as well? Usually when customers go through a journey, I encourage them to create maybe a cloud-specific financial insight, maybe an addendum to what they do, because there's an element sometimes inside of organizations that they view cloud as variable, so that when they have to save money, they just say shut off a bunch of things in the cloud, which hopefully you can do and you have those levers, but you need to have a regular discipline of awareness around what are the practices, who's doing this well, who maybe needs some help as a part of this. So these are kind of the 5 things I would recommend as you go through this. So in terms of the cracking the code here, think about tags. I know I worked with one company. They were so irritated that nobody was adhering to tagging, they would keep KPIs, that they basically just started shutting off any production environment that was not tagged accurately. Engineers will very quickly solve tagging if their systems start getting turned off. So that's a little hardcore, so you may not want to go there. Maybe start with dev and QA environments. But an environment where you can really have things that matter and hold people accountable is important as you go through the analytics on this. Next is around training. Education and awareness is a big deal. I just captured this learning pyramid. We can put ourselves in the top portion now in terms of lecture, so you won't remember too much from today. But as you go down the scale, the more you get your hands on keyboard and get into this, the more you'll learn. And I think that's something that's important. So in terms of some resources I wanted to call out, one, I think there were 7 FinOps sessions as a part of reInvent, some still to come. I know some are very closely tied to it, especially as you get into some of the Q for Business and other capabilities. The end-all be-all for many of us, if you haven't read JR and Mike's book on Cloud FinOps, is a great read. It's on the shelf of most FinOps practitioners, and it has a lot of really good context within that. There's a free skill builder course I send to a lot of customers, especially I work with finance people a lot who many don't know a lot about cloud. So there's a Cloud for Finance professional training that's fully free. What I typically do is encourage customers to take it. I set a deadline for them, just arbitrary 6 weeks, 8 weeks out as a forcing function to take it, and then have an active learning session at the end of it. Use that as a way to force conversation, ask questions in a safe environment, versus it just being added to the pile of things that you need to do and maybe don't get done. Foundation's great. I know AWS and other cloud providers are members of the FinOps Foundation. I'm sure some of you engage in that as well. They have training, but the community side of this is super powerful. So I would encourage you to engage there. And as you think about all the other community elements, some of this is also just hands-on. I know there's some sessions here where you can bring your laptop and engage. Peer-to-peer connects is something I do a lot. So I have my favorite companies that I've met with who have really mature FinOps practices and are friendly to meet with others. So if you're ever interested to meet with another customer to learn about their practice, we're going to get insight from Ron today, which I'm very excited about. But there's so many companies out there that are doing great things. Feel free to reach out to AWS or to me or your account manager to get paired up there. So as you think about cracking the code here, be really intentional. Usually when I talk to teams about training, time is the biggest consideration. I have a lot of job to do. I don't have a lot of capacity. One company created an Invested in Yourself Day, one Friday a month. They aligned within their vertical team so that everybody didn't put calendar meetings all over their calendar. And they used this as a way to dedicate towards learning and development. And what naturally happened for that company, it wasn't all individual. Some of this was team-based. So they wanted to learn something and do it together. They wanted to experiment with something and do it together. And there was an expectation that you shared what you did as a part of your Invest in Yourself Day. So it was a reinforcing element. So time would something be that I would encourage you as you go through this. Next is around grow, and what are the ways by which you can expand the functionality now that you've set up the baseline element of that. And the first element is the team itself. So here's a simple structure of what I typically see. This would be an example of a larger enterprise. As I mentioned earlier, it's usually 1 or 2 people or 0, a half an FTE as a part of this. But in a typical team that's more mature, there typically is a lead of some degree. You'll see under there about 70% of FinOps teams reside within IT across the globe. When I started, it resided in finance, but in the same company now it resides within IT. So it's important less around the organization, but more around having the right skills as a part of it. The personas that typically are within this team is a blend, and you'll see that middle swim lane, it tends to be a melting pot of skills. There, on the right side, there tends to be a BI or reporting element of this, someone who can do the data analysis, integrate the information together. In the middle is an analytical function. Again, this could be someone who's technical and has analytics, but also somebody within the finance world. And lastly is both architects and developers. You'll tend to see that they also play an active role in this. But one of the key roles is the bottom role, is a champion. They don't have to do a lot, but I know when I meet with customers, you need an advocate as you're building your FinOps ecosystem. When you need a team to focus on something and you're not getting a response, you need an escalation point. You need somebody you can lean on that knows that this is important and makes it a priority. So I really encourage sponsorship inside of an organization. That could be the CFO, it could be the CTO, it could be the head of engineering. Whoever that is needs to be somebody who's really passionate about this and is somebody who's going to help you through this journey. In terms of the cracking the code here, is just start small. Like this, you don't have to overthink this. As I mentioned earlier, most teams are virtual. They're not dedicated organizations to it. Large enterprises do have some dedicated resources, but others are just interested individuals. This is part of their job. So don't get too detailed in terms of we need an org, I need to fund it. The rule of thumb I tend to give, just like a procurement role, a FinOps resource should pay for themselves multiple times over. I know one company I met with is 1 time over, another is 5 times over. But in real savings, not made-up savings and cost avoidance. This is an ability to drive efficiency, and these resources are experts in the way in which they can do that. Next up is technology and tools. Obviously, some of you, and you're here at reInvent, so you know the AWS tools and technology. Last reInvent, AWS Cost Optimization Hub was released, which is, I've gotten a lot of strong feedback from customers. Most analytical people in FinOps team want the raw data. They want to dig in themselves or leverage their own platforms as a part of it, and that's where the cost and usage report comes in handy. But I get a lot of questions around third-party tools. What are the tools that should be leveraged? This is not an exhaustive list. This is just the list that I typically hear when I engage with customers. And it's typically the pattern I see normally is we need help. We engage a third-party tool. They leverage the tool for a while, and they find out that one, it's a little expensive, and it takes a long time to work. Then they move tools. Try a new tool because it sounds better, which is great. They get some benefit from that, and then usually it'll evolve through time, and it'll take several years, and it'll be the first one. They just build a purpose-built tool inside of their company. There was an article I did with CIO Magazine a couple months ago where there's a big trend of homegrown tools in this space, which tactically doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about all the great tools and technology that cloud providers have and AWS has, as well as these other tools I'm about to go through. But there's a balancing act around how much do you want to pay for these tools versus what's the value you get. It's kind of that mindset you have. Some of the ones I always typically hear about, Cloudability comes up a lot as a part of it. Cloud Health as well comes up quickly. And some of these other, Cloud Zero is one I've heard more about over the last year. And then there's a whole list. Cloud Checker, there's a ton of FinOut. There's a lot of other tools that are out there and a lot of great tools. And usually when you see tools spawning out and a lot of startups occurring, either consulting or in supporting this, it's because it's becoming really important to the business in the way and the opportunities that are there. Next up, in terms of the cracking the code, there's not a one-size-fits-all. I'll get asked, what's the one tool you recommend? It depends. What are you trying to accomplish? It's not about the tool, it's what you're trying to accomplish with it. So make sure you keep that in mind. You can get pretty frustrated if you do all the work to implement a tool and then you're not getting the outcome you need. So you really need to bring the cultural side of it internally as well. Next is around forecasting. This is not an easy thing. I get a lot of questions around this. So I'm sharing just high level some of the specifics that I typically hear and what works well. And I'll just use the crawl, walk, run model. On the crawl side, most teams will look at run rate. They'll say, hey, I've spent $1 million a month. I'm probably going to spend $1 million a month going forward. Anybody here who's done forecasting, especially with cloud and a migration, know that's not going to work too well for too long. It could scale up, it could scale down, things could move. So while this could be reasonable, especially when you're on a consistent run rate, when you're migrating, this is a tough way to do it because it's very hard to predict. Usually you have to assume some growth rate on top of it and then adjust that through time. But most companies start out with the basics, and this is how they would probably forecast something outside of cloud as well. Next is a blend. I always encourage people to think of the Pareto principle. When I look at customers' bills and look at the accounts or applications, 20% of the apps drive 80% of the costs. So narrow your focus in on some of the bigger apps. Maybe think about the top 5, top 10. Really be able to partner with them and really then hone skills around expectations and forecasting on that. If you can get those apps right, you likely will get the aggregate forecast right. I did include Amazon Forecast. There's a lot of other tools that Amazon has that have machine learning capabilities that can look at your consumption patterns and do a projection on that, which is helpful. But the key is to get input from the business. The first one, you're doing this in isolation. You're not talking to anyone. The second one, you're beginning to get input. How's the business going to grow? What does revenue look like? What do the dynamics look like on the volume side? So you really need to get some of those impacts, especially for the big ones. And then lastly, it tends to be a blend. It can be centrally done. It can be done in a federated way and consolidated. But usually there's a machine learning capability that's leveraged as a part of this. It's machine driven. It's not individual model driven. And it tends to be a bit more accurate. But you also include a lot of other variables as a part of it. So the assumptions are key. I know when I was forecasting, especially towards the end of my journey, we were thinking about how are AWS rates going to change. Most customers don't assume rate changes, but if we see a pattern of rate reductions, which is great, or generation changes where there's an opportunity, great. How do we bake that in? But also inflationary pressures, and anybody who does forecasting, especially with labor in the last couple of years, there's a lot of upward pressure. How do I account for some of those in addition to what's out there already? So the cracking the code here in a second, I'll go through allocations, is I'll talk through allocations, and the first is granularity and accuracy. As you all know, if anybody here has done allocations, I've spent 5 years of my life going from chargeback to showback and having the most detailed allocations possible because we were really proud around how accurate we're going to be. But in reality, what business decisions were changing was pretty minimal. So you need to be really mindful as you go through this in terms of striking the balance. Automation is key. I know some of the platforms mentioned earlier, specifically like Apptio, they have other allocation engines that can support IT allocations. As you get into the details though, if you're manually collecting information or lagging information 1 month out, it gets really manual in nature. So I would highly encourage automation and maybe think of drivers for allocations that are only available as a proxy for that. Next is explainability. I don't know if many of you have sat in front of a business leader and tried to explain IT allocations. It can be a complicated conversation, especially as you think about app dev teams are pretty easy to explain. The business knows what they are. They know what they work on. Then you go a little bit deeper to maybe shared teams, a data team that's centrally managed. The business is like, what are they all doing? I'm not sure am I really getting the value out of all those resources? And then you get to something like cyber. I don't know if anybody's tried to explain cyber to a business leader in terms of what they're paying for. Some of that is you don't want that business leader to have a say in your cyber strategy, but you need to be able to articulate it. So explainability is critical. I really encourage you as you think about IT allocations, don't get so lost into the technical jargon. Think about the business, the way in which they do it, and how can you attribute information towards that business. So businesses want levers and ability to change cost, especially within the cloud. So as you think about this, be really purposeful about the way in which you do it. Next is consistency. I worked for a company that was publicly traded, so you had to be very sensitive around external disclosures and trends through time. So you need to be really mindful, specifically with IT, that as you go to the cloud, you're going to get a lot more insight to who's consuming what, which is great. That's awesome. That also can have a downstream impact to the P&Ls of the businesses in which you support and the products that are there. So be really mindful as you go through this. Changing things really frequently can be really just confusing for the business. Most customers will do annual reviews of methodologies specifically for allocations to make sure there's some element of consistency and process as a part of it. And then lastly is peer-to-peer. I can't stress enough, ever since I know when I was a customer, You can get somewhat insular in your world of the way in which you're operated. Now that I'm at AWS, I'm like, why was I not talking to the same person in my job in another company? Like, I need to be fostering that. So leveraging the foundation of FinOps is great, your AWS team is great, but also just through LinkedIn. I've never used LinkedIn more in my life than I have since I've joined AWS. But it's incredible the way in which you can connect with others, and specifically an event like this is a great way to do it for people here. So I would encourage you to make some connections. So the cracking the code here is, it's an iterative process. Don't overthink it, don't overcomplicate it, and maybe just think of this almost with agile principles as a way in which you can fail fast, test and learn, and pivot as you go through it. The last section for me before you hear from Ron is scale. What are the ways by which you can drive automation and consistency through this? Ton of opportunities for cost optimization. In my reviewing of builds, there's pretty consistent themes that I see, so I thought I'd share those with you. Over-provisioned resources is by far number one as I look at builds. So what's the size of EC2 that you're leveraging? What's truly leveraged, and what's the resource utilization tied to that? So be really mindful on right sizing. I met with one customer once that had a lot of junior engineers as a part of it. And a lot of them love to share code as a part of it. And somebody had embedded an XXL size EC2 instance as a part of the provisioning as a part of it. Then all of the young engineers started using it, and the bills went through the roof. And they were like, what's going on? What are the ways in which what's happening? So think through your way in which you're keeping an eye on provisioning and resource utilization. Next is storage lifecycle. Usually, some companies will hear a soundbite that storage is free. And we all know, if anybody here has looked at an S3 bill, we're paying for S3. Like, we've got to be really mindful of storage. A lot of companies will have data warehouses through third party, like a Databricks or a Snowflake, but also leverage S3 and things like that. Be really mindful of what storage lifecycle that you have on that. There's obviously tooling AWS has that will do this on your behalf, given the configurations. But it's not something you want to store 2 and 3 sets of the same version of data across different places. Latest instance sizing, I know sometimes technical debt is viewed when you go to the cloud, you remove technical debt from moving on-prem, but you can build technical debt in the cloud as well, especially if you're not taking of the latest price performance of EC2 instances, so keep that in mind. Idle resources, you'll hear things like dimmer switches, nights and weekends. I know for a while we were hoping when I was a customer that people would opt in to turn things off nights and weekends. Not a lot of people opted in. You have to almost inverse this. Everybody's opted out. You're turned off nights and weekends for especially production or non-production environments, and you have to opt in if you want to keep it on. So be really mindful of how do you make the right thing easy to do. And then last thing is obviously the way in which you buy. A lot of times I'll work with teams and and AWS is looking for a commitment of some sort. Hey, do you want to sign an agreement, make a multi-year commitment? And the customer's like, I'm not sure I want to make a commitment. There's a ton of great ways in which you can buy AWS services and do it at a fairly discounted rate. If you don't want to do this yourself, there's also a ton of partners who can do this on your behalf as well, and almost do pooling of commitments and then have limited commitments directly to customers and pass on a lot of the savings. So there's a ton of great creative ways to do this. So in terms of cracking the code here, I would just make sure you're continuously monitoring and you're really focusing on a cost culture. I met with a customer yesterday who I'd met with in the past. And when I was talking to the head of FinOps, I said, how do you review your cloud bill? And he walked me through specifically, literally he wakes up in the morning and it's the first thing he does. He's memorized all the numbers of what each account should be based on what it was, and he's leaning in manually as a part of it. So the cost consciousness was there. I was really excited about that. But what happens when he's on vacation? What happens when he's not there? Like, thinking through using systems and automation as a part of this is really, really important. I talk to a lot of CFOs, and CFOs love numbers and metrics, so I have a lot of metrics. So I wanted to share some of my favorite metrics, and I'll pull them all up on here for you. There's a ton of metrics. You obviously, and I just highlighted 2 here of my favorite. One is on the visibility side. I'm a big believer in efficiency ratio, and the math of that, and you'll see there, is just cost divided by revenue. Pretty basic. So you can look at a total company efficiency ratio. You can look at an IT efficiency ratio. This one here is a cloud efficiency ratio. And the beauty of this is internally you can trend this through time. Is enabling technology growing the business? Are we reducing cost or growing revenue? And if it's not delivering the value prop that we talked about earlier, action should be taken. On the right-hand side, one of my favorites is just who's doing a good job using the cloud. How do you do, and I'll talk in a minute around gamification, because a lot of companies love to gamify things, but how do you highlight and reward people who use the cloud well? And how do you highlight those and maybe lean on those and not? One company, they had a top 10, bottom 10. And it was top 10 most efficient application teams and bottom 10 least efficient. And what the requirement was if you were on the bottom 10, you had to be mentored by the app owner of the top 10. So it was a way in which to coach and help them learn. But I think it's a way in which you need to really shine a spotlight. Don't get overwhelmed. I did include a lot of metrics here. You don't need to report on all these metrics. Again, simplicity and explainability matter, but I just wanted to give you some options as you think through it. So the cracking the code here is really just think about triggers. That would be, what are targets? What are the ways by which you can have triggers and alerts on them? I know for me, a big breakthrough, because Slack is used by a lot of engineers, I always like to think about where do engineers work and how do I bring financial data to them? Sometimes they're not going to look at a report. If, as many reports as you can create, they're not going to go seek that out unless they're really passionate about it. So you need to bring financial data to them as you think through this. In terms of the cost culture, there's a lot of questions here, but you can imagine in my job, I go into a lot of customers. I'm asking them questions. So I just kind of listed out what are the questions I typically ask, and these potentially could be ones that you leverage internally depending on what your role is. The one, how do you budget? Who's accountable for budgets? The typical answer for that is some level of an executive, somebody high level. It's not an engineer, it's somebody at more senior level. What happens if you don't meet the budget? You can probably think about the answers I get on that one. It ranges from you no longer in a job to it doesn't matter at all. So it's a wide spectrum depending on the culture of the company. But thinking about what's the accountability model today in the company is important to consider as you think about FinOps. How do you balance top down and bottoms up? Can you provide an example of a great win recently? That's something I love. So based on that, there's a bunch of ways in which you can direct it, and I'll put all these up here for you. So as you think through the specifics, I would encourage you, depending on what your role is, to maybe think through what are the right questions you could ask inside of your organization, and then what will you do with that information to help drive change inside of the organization. So in terms of cracking the code here, tailor your approach to your organization's need. As I mentioned, there's a spectrum. It depends on the culture of your company around how hard you can push on these things and how much they'll focus on it. The last thing I'll share here before I hand it over to Ron, I found this model called the ADA model. It's specifically a marketing model, but I wanted to relay it to FinOps. And as you read through it, you really need to think about the communication and change management as you go through your FinOps journey. This isn't about doing all the right work and then nobody's aware of it. You need to share success stories. You need to have interviews with people. You need to really invite engineers who are really good at this to help others as well. So I put some ideas on the right. One company I met with, they had a bounty program. So they used a 2-week sprint and encouraged everyone in the company. They took a baseline before of what their cloud spend was, and whoever had the largest % reduction, and they couldn't just turn off every application. But they all got an iPad, the application team, individually for work. So thinking through a way in which small investment, like a t-shirt, swag, a laptop sticker, the things that people care a lot about, ultimately can have fun by doing the right thing. It helps build the culture that's a part of it. There's a lot of tech talks I get asked, or a company gets asked to talk to, where they maybe devote 1 hour a month and a lunch and learn, where you'll invite an expert in on some topic. This is a great way to infuse, and maybe from a peer group or AWS or maybe the foundation, the FinOps Foundation, they can come speak and help educate you on some of this. So just make sure that you're rewarding the right behavior. As you all know, it's not about money. People love money, but it's not all about money. It's about recognition of doing the right thing and knowing it's valued inside of the organization. So here's a quick summary of all the cracking the code insights. There's obviously, we've covered a lot here, and this content will be available afterwards on reInvent. But I did want to turn it over to Ron to go through the FinOps journey within Wiz. So come on up, Ron.
Thanks. So first of all, thank you, Chris, for inviting me. I'm super excited to be here this morning. My name is Ron Tsruya, and I'm leading the Wiz FinOps team. I know it's early, but in the next 15 minutes, we are going to talk about a very interesting topic, the FinOps adventures in the hypergrowth jungle. Wiz was born just about 5 years ago with a mission: secure everything you build and run in the cloud. Today, we are the largest private cybersecurity company in the entire world, and considered by many as the leader in the cloud security space. More than 45% of the Fortune 100 and thousands of different organizations choose to protect their cloud environments with Wiz. We are protecting hundreds of millions of cloud assets across all cloud service providers. And in the last couple of years, we've been in the news quite a lot. We were announced as the fastest company to grow from 1 million to 100 million in ARR, and also to 500 million in ARR. Asaf, our CEO, led the global Forbes cover for the cloud technology companies. We acquired new companies, we set new valuation records, and it seems like the company is growing and everyone is happy. So why am I here? I'm here because, as you know, someone needs to pay the bills, right? And today, organizations are worried about their cloud spend and operations. Look what McKinsey is saying. Only 15% of companies can link between their cloud cost to business value. It's absolutely amazing. When it comes to a typical cloud project, you know how it goes. You usually start in day one, and things can quickly escalate and get out of control. You can find yourself after a few months with double, triple, or even more your original spend. So I'm going back to where I started. How do you control the FinOps in the hypergrowth jungle? Today, I'm going to focus on 3 key main elements. They were stated by the FinOps Foundation as the key cornerstones to manage your cloud cost and operation. The first one is the information. How do you control the cloud data? I think that many organizations suffer from the same problem, which I called the Excelization of the cloud. When I say Excelization of the cloud, I mean that in one organization, many different stakeholders are trying to explain the same thing using different Excel sheets, different data sources. It can create a lot of confusion and even frustration. So I think that the first task is to gather all the data from the different cloud service providers, put everything in one place, in one simple file that speaks one language. Even for very complex cloud environments, I truly believe that you can sum up everything into a simple Excel sheet. The most important thing is to make sure that every dollar goes with a KPI. The KPIs are not different than the regular P&L categories, the COGS, the sales, the R&D. And what is interesting, obviously depends on the organization. It can be the customer acquisition cost, the POC cost, the customer adoption, the unit economics, you name it. Every stakeholder should own their KPI. You or I have the full holistic view of the data. And I'm going back to the simple sheet I showed you a few moments ago. I have all the information I need in one place. The monthly trend, the business results, the product adoption, KPIs for product, R&D, sales. And once I got it, I can basically address any type of question. You want to see the revenues versus cloud COGS? Super easy. You want to see the product adoption versus unit economics? That's additional 2 clicks. I know in the beginning it can take some time, but today you can obviously automate this entire process using the many tools that are available on the market. We have the data, we have the KPIs, we can move on to advanced analytics, specifically for tracking and alerting. In the last couple of years, we dramatically improved our tracking and alerting mechanism. We want to identify cost anomalies exactly when they happen and avoid significant cost implications. We want to meet our engineering team wherever they operate in their day-to-day. In this case, we built an automated alerting mechanism directly through Slack. As you can see, there is an alert that comes directly from our AWS accounts and notifies our engineering team with all the information they need in order to identify and solve the problem. They have the when, the what, and how much it costs. On another example, when Wiz is launching a new product family, in this case, the Wiz Runtime Sensor, we are already building all the tracking dashboards in place. As you can see, on one dashboard, we have the multi-cost trend with the different costs from the different cloud service providers. We have the cost KPI over time. We have the product adoption. Imagine how easily the business owner can track his business over time, compare himself to others, identify anomalies. Again, we want all the information in one place. Now, let's move on to the second part, the optimization. How are we actually going to reduce our overall cloud spend? Before that, let's have a look at Wiz product architecture. How are we going to optimize it? So today I'm not going to talk about product architecture or re-architecture. I really believe that by keeping things simple, you can achieve significant optimizations, goals, and targets. I'm going to tell you a secret. Building partnerships is one of the best ways to reduce your overall cloud spend. Specifically in Wiz, we are competing against huge companies, amazing organizations. Most of them are publicly traded, valued at tens of billions of dollars or even more. Obviously, these companies have significant commercial power and very good relationship with their vendors. So in order to compete with them, we have to get as big as we can. When it comes to our partnerships, we truly believe in building sustainable partnerships, not a typical vendor-customer relationship. With our cloud agreements, we will be as aggressive as possible. Sign the longest possible agreements with the highest possible commitment. And today, we have a clear strategy. We are a marketplace-first company as a vendor and as a buyer. We will always prefer to sell and buy through the marketplace. I'm going to ask you the following key question. What % of your IT spend is going to the AWS Marketplace platform? If the answer is not getting close to 100%, or we have a plan to get it to 100%, you are basically leaving money on the table. Today, you can easily buy the best cloud security solution directly through the marketplace. It can be Wiz, but it can basically be any other IT tool you have on your stack. By doing it, you can significantly increase your overall spend and footprint within AWS and become a much bigger player than you actually are today. When you invest in this type of partnerships, good things happen. And if you don't believe me, believe this guy. This is Adam Selipsky, the former AWS CEO. Last year reInvent on the main stage. He is mentioning no other than Wiz as a great example of an AWS partner. Also, Wiz was announced as the AWS Marketplace Partner of the Year for the EMEA region for 2023, and just yesterday, we were announced as the Global AWS Partner of the Year. That's what happens when you truly invest in this type of partnerships. I think that today it's clear. AWS are here to help. You should build a sustainable business together. They are here to assist you. Ask yourself the following key questions. Do you have a planned quarterly business review with AWS? Did AWS provide you with an optimization plan? If the answer again is no, it's time to take action, and you can start today. Now, let's talk a little bit about the elephant in the room, the technical gap. I'm not an engineer. My background is completely financial. How do you master and control so many different AWS services? This is a partial list of the different AWS service categories, hundreds of different services. I think it's important to understand the engineers know best. Specifically in Wiz, we have hundreds of years of combined cloud engineering experience. Our engineers know how to make their products and features as efficient as possible. We are one team and working together on our mutual goal. We will build together the FinOps ROI, the potential saving versus efforts. After working with the engineer, we are mapping all the potential cost-saving opportunities on one metrics. As you can see, on one axis, we have the effort. This is our subjective measurement on what is our ability to fully perform the cost optimization project. On the vertical axis, we have the potential saving in millions of dollars. Look how easily you can identify the different cost-saving opportunities. You can map them by their progress. You can easily present these metrics to your leadership, to your R&D leadership, to your CEO, and easily identify where you want to focus. And obviously, balance is the key. We can shut down all R&D efforts and focus on cost optimization alone. We will reduce our overall cloud spend, but we won't have new features, won't have new capabilities, and we will lose the competition. I think it's fair enough to ask that we will have at least one cost optimization project in each R&D sprint. And obviously, we are going to start with the low-hanging fruit, the projects with the highest potential saving versus lowest effort required. Over time, these projects are aggregated into a significant cost reduction. Now, let's move on to the last aspect, the operation. How are we going to build a FinOps culture within our organization? We want to make radical changes, and radical changes starts with management awareness and engagement. I want to make sure that my CEO and leadership are aware of our cloud spend and the KPIs we discussed about a few moments ago. We want to start to create this momentum. Again, cost optimization is an organizational effort. Secondly, FinOps teams will always be outnumbered against the total numbers of engineers in your organization. As I told you earlier, we are one team and we have a mutual goal. I will be the key focal point for cloud operations. Provide them with knowledge, tools, dashboards, information, everything that they need in order to achieve our mutual goal. And let's talk a little bit about the snowball effect. In this case, SEG202, one of our engineers, he is sitting right here. Thank you, Sagi. He performed the cost optimization project using Amazon Elasticsearch service. We worked with our AWS team, which is also here, and published a mutual blog post explaining exactly what happened. And it's not ending up there. AWS themselves, again, last year reInvent, they are on stage and mentioning the project made by SEG202 from Wiz, and how he was able to boost performance and save a lot of money. Also, Roy Resnick, our VP R&D and one of our co-founders, he published a mutual blog post with the AWS Neptune team on how we were able to save a lot of money. Again, that's an organizational effort. Our engineers, our leaders, everyone is taking part. Imagine their peers, their colleagues. People understand that cost optimization can actually become very cool, and everyone wants to participate and lead their own project. That's the snowball effect. Last but not least, I think that today, FinOps teams are not limited to cost optimization at all. Understanding the keys of your cost structure can be the foundation to business partner with the R&D and technology departments, to pricing, to deal desk approvals, and many more things. So, to sum up, we discussed about 3 key elements: the information, the optimization, and the operation. I think that today it's clear. Controlling your cost is a key for healthy growth. Thank you for listening, and come visit our booth.
Thanks, Ron. Great job, man. Yeah, we'll have his booth number up in a minute, so you can go see the Wiz booth. I did want to make, just as we close out here, some resources available to you to think about. This one here is a Cloud Financial Capability Assessment or FinOps Capability Assessment. It's a great free service you can take advantage of from AWS, where you'll actually can get some benchmarking information. It's kind of self-reported, so it's a guided questions where you can assess what's the maturity of your FinOps practice across multiple dimensions. How does that compare to other customers? So you'll get a spider diagram of how you compare there. But it's a perfect way. A lot of customers that I know will do this. They'll just do it once a year. They'll do an assessment. You ultimately will get almost like a backlog created based on what's here, and specifically enabled to then work that backlog, can reassess, and it gives you a score assessment around how you go through that. So I don't know if many of you have gone through that, but I would definitely encourage you to do that. There's a ton of other resources as well. Make sure some of the best people out there are the AWS Cloud Economics team, which is a great team inside of AWS that can help partner with you. You'll hear a term called TAM, or Technical Account Manager. Typically with every account, there's some support of a TAM. These are incredible experts who support topics such as FinOps. So take full advantage of that as well. Definitely big shout out and thanks to Ron. I would encourage you to connect with him through LinkedIn. Incredible insight of what's happening with Wiz. I know I got inspired by that, and I appreciate Ron sharing. But also encourage you to also take the survey as a part of this, as we'd love to improve and evolve this through time. So pleasure to be with you today. Both Ron and I are going to be stage side here if anybody's interested to talk further versus a broader Q&A for everyone. But thanks for making the time, and feel free to reach out if you ever have any questions about this topic. Thanks so much.